You're listening to Cinema Red Pill, a movie podcast in Uganda, and I'm Sharon, and today we're going to speak about Ousmane Semebene. And I have 5 other people along with me to talk about his movies and his legacy as an African filmmaker. I have my recurring contributors, Timothy, Joel, and Nick. And for the first time, I have Gary, who's also a Ugandan filmmaker. And on call, I have Oscar. So I'll have the 2 new people introduce themselves. Let me start with Gary. Gary, first talk a bit.
Gary Mugisha, filmmaker, dad. Extraordinaire.
Okay, Oscar, can you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and your interest in African cinema, your background and all?
Sure. Hello there from the UK. My name's Oscar Harding. I run the African Cinema subreddit on Reddit. Within our first 24 hours, we became the 5th most popular subreddit on the internet. So I've been involved with African cinema for the last couple of years in terms of the academics of it and the history, and huge fan of Sembène.
Oh, okay. Anything about the personal work you've been doing?
So I'm also a filmmaker. In the past, I've worked on a Jordanian film called Thebe, which was Oscar nominated 2 years ago for the Best Foreign Language Film. I'm also involved in the distribution and marketing of feature films here in the UK.
Okay, that's great. So we're going to talk about Sembene's documentary first, and with that we'll be able to talk about the man himself as a filmmaker, the father of African cinema as they call him, and his work that he has done. So a bit about him: he's Senegalese, in case anyone doesn't know. And yesterday, all of us here actually watched the film Sembene, the documentary, because it's been filming this weekend. They've been screening it this weekend in all African countries. So
I don't think all.
All, they said all. Isn't it all?
Almost.
Okay, almost all of them.
How does an ordinary man rise from a laborer and a dock worker to become the father of African cinema? How does an ordinary man do extraordinary things? An ordinary man doesn't. Ousmane Semebene spent 40 years using any means necessary to make movies that shared tough truths, exposed injustice, and imagined a better world. This is our story about the filmmaker who, against enormous odds, reclaimed Africa's stories. This is our story of Sembène.
So, I'll have Joel speak first about the film.
Awesome. So Sembene was made by Sembene's autobiographer.
Yeah.
What was his name?
Samba.
Yeah, Samba. So yeah, this was a great film for someone who just entered film. I know he co-directed, but for first film, this was really good. So basically, for me, this was my introduction, I would say, to like Sembene's personal life and history. I mean, I'd seen some of his movies, but aside from that, I didn't really know that much about him. So it was nice to see the genesis. His first film, Borom Sarat, which is my favorite of his films. Yeah, for me that was the pinnacle of Sembene films. And he had such a great eye, such a great grasp of film language. Because like just watching Borom Sarat for instance, it manages sort of encapsulate all the struggles of like the working class African man. I'll say a highlight for me was there's a certain section of the movie where they tackle his dark side, where he sort of screws these young filmmakers over and takes money that was intended for them to make a movie. And I loved sort of how unapologetic he was. He says this thing of how he will sleep with the devil or something to make a film. He had such determination and did a lot of questionable things. Like that last film about the girl mutilation, what he did to that kid. Yeah, that was kind of difficult to watch, but I sort of admired his So determined, like he was willing to go into hellfire to like get this film done. And yeah, I don't think we have really people cut from the same cloth as he was today. Not that many. He was a special kind of badass. So this film again is very straightforward. I think under normal circumstances I would have thought it was a basic documentary, but yeah, because it doesn't really like focus on a particular aspect or angle. It's just Sembène in broad strokes. But for someone like me, when getting an introduction, it was a great introduction, and I think it really tried its best to capture his entire legacy, and I think it did a good job overall. Yeah.
Okay. Oscar, your thoughts on the documentary?
Well, I'd agree with a lot of what's just been said. Sembène's a badass. I found the examination of his dark side particularly interesting, how he screwed over one of his proteges over the making of Camp de Charoy. But he does justify it. And one thing that I've learnt in the last few years, learning about African cinema, which a lot of people both inside and outside of the continent aren't aware of, is that it's very much the realm of the individual. You need someone as strong-willed as Sembène to really get a film made and to define a country and its culture. So African cinema, from what I've seen and from what I've learned, there's not really collectives or movements of different artists and filmmakers. Everyone is sort of out there on their own, not seeking help and making the boldest film they can. And as was just said, there's not really been many African filmmakers cut from the same cloth since Sembène to emerge. So I think his shadow looms not just over Senegal, but the entire continent's cinema up to this day, which is both a help and a hindrance, I think, to African filmmakers. And it's a very comprehensive documentary. I think it's a great introduction. I don't think it's a particularly cinematic documentary, despite the stock footage. It's not like The Imposter or The Thin Blue Line, where it feels like a great film as well as a great documentary. Another thing that benefits it is Samba Kajigo's voiceover. I wish the guy would do more voiceover stuff. He's got a very good voice. But I think the animations work as well. I think overall this is one of the strongest documentaries I've seen in quite a while. It might have just benefited perhaps from feeling a little bit more cinematic, but otherwise I'd recommend this to anyone. It's very accessible. I like how it doesn't shy away from the flaws of Sembène, so it's not just a fan documentary. There's quite a few of those around and they're not particularly good. So I think this is a solid film that everyone should see, especially if you know nothing about African cinema or about Sembène.
Okay, thanks. Nicholas, what do you think?
Alright, Ousmane Semebene. There's something interesting about this movie that, from my own personal perspective, I think should be mentioned, is that a lot of Africans don't know about African cinema.
Yep.
Including those that are interested in cinema like myself. I just found out about Sembène yesterday evening while I was watching this documentary. And it was a bit of a shock, not a shock as such, because I wasn't invested in African cinema, that there were these people that were going out there and making a difference in the film industry. I thought Africa was a land of practicalities, and a thing like cinema or the arts are not a practicality. You can't really make a living off of something like that in a land like this. So to find out about a man like Ousmane Semebene, it's an interesting experience. So for one thing, that's where this documentary struck me. The second thing was how they portrayed Ousmane Semebene as a man. He was a man of, as they said many times yesterday, a man of contradictions. He was a living contradiction, like most of us are. He would say one thing and live another, and it reflected in his art and eventually in his life. It was full of bitter ironies. I remember the time they mentioned when he moved to Paris.
Yeah, Marseille.
Yeah. Yes, and he was going around. He was a rock star now. People were appreciating his work.
It was New York.
It was when he
New
went to the
York.
US.
Yes. Thank you. It was New York, and people were starting to appreciate his work. And they said this single but very bitter line: he was more appreciated there than he ever was in Africa.
That's sad.
And it's true for any African artist. You can ask anyone here. It's true. Every African artist is almost always more appreciated anywhere else other than Africa. And seeing as it's Sunday, I may as well hit you with a biblical line. John 4:44, it says, a prophet is ill appreciated in his own home. And that's Jesus who said that. So I think he knew what he was talking about. And it was the same for Ousmane Semebene. And these contradictions of him betraying his own proteges, as was mentioned before, and him betraying his own family, as his son put out in the documentary, everything about him saying that he's doing this for Africa, but what about your own Africans? What about your own friends? What are you doing for them? Nothing. It was brought out in a very stark contrast, as is the nature of his films, as was in this documentary. The documentary, like was mentioned, was very straightforward. It was a straight shoot. That's the case with most African films. It's a straight shoot. This guy is here, she is there, this is the reality. You deal with it, and it's mostly in a graveyard face. I don't know. That's what was happening with this man's life as was portrayed in this documentary. And at the end, he was going blind, which is like a bitter fate of a filmmaker. It's tragic when a person dealing in the visual arts loses his own sight and makes a movie about female genital mutilation, and then he hits us with another great contradiction. He basically psychologically tortures this young girl. She doesn't look any older than 10, and even in even with the stock footage, it was hard to look at. But that was this man. He was a great man. He was visionary and powerful in a way. I'm glad to have seen it, and that's all I have to say about this guy.
Timothy?
I'm going straight. Okay.
Yeah.
I think everything has already been said, at least the main stuff about the film. But the part which interested me the most was the part where I think they're talking about Sembene the rebel. This period of his after the independence, when they're talking about how Africa had lost basically all its heroes, and so basically Sembene was like this guy who was there critiquing African society in general, African governance. And I think I've seen about 3 of his films. I've seen Borom Sarit, Black Girl, I've seen Hala. And Hala is a really good film because whatever is there, I think I was talking to Sharon yesterday, was saying it still rings true today. Everything from the beginning to the end, everything with the government and the corruption and how basically our leaders are still puppets. I really appreciated that from, I think that's my favorite Sembene film. So again, another thing I think I saw from the documentary was, Sembene was a great filmmaker, but I read in this book, Questioning African Cinema, where Bekolo spoke that in Africa, you only see the old director and the young one. Like, you rarely see that progression. Like, there's Sembene, then there's everyone else. Even right now in Africa, the filmmakers, there's like one filmmaker who's known throughout the country, then there are all the others who are trying to so I don't know, I feel as much as he's a person who was the father of African cinema, I feel probably they said I didn't say anything that the person who he stole the money from, Diop, was called Boris Diop. I don't know if he made any other film after Camp Royal, that whole saga. But I feel probably Sembene should have done a bit more, because if someone with that kind of reach, you're hanging out with Orson Welles, you're hanging out with Gordon Parks, all those people, you should at least probably have more proteges. Like, unlike someone like Jean Rouch, who is well known, most of these people, the Omar Ugandas, all went on to become legendary African filmmakers in their own right. So as much as it was great, again, it brought to light his other side, which I had heard about the whole thing of him taking the money and all that, but I hadn't actually seen this DOP guy actually tell you what happened and how they had made the script, and then he went and made his own and took the funds. So probably that's the one thing I took away, as like, because I had this image of Sembene as this great person, and I thought the documentary would pretty much be that, you know, how everyone is just praising him and everything, but to see this other side of him was also interesting, and it kind of, I won't say dulled his legacy in my eyes, but it's like a dent. Like, you realize these people weren't as, they were flawed individuals. As much as they're geniuses and legends in their own right, they're also very flawed individuals. Yeah.
Gary, your word?
Mine is just a quick one from his. I'm more interested in more of origins of something. So like, what created the man with all these contradictions? I realized that time when he broke his back, the 6 months in between on the hospital bed, I think even enhanced the ability to observe. Now, since he was no longer participating, there wasn't a lot of noise, so he got time to actually focus on real issues, which I even enhance his drive to make him the legendary filmmaker he is right now. I guess so.
Okay, my thoughts would be, I kind of disagree with, I got a different reaction compared to Timothy, where knowing that he was an imperfect person made me like him more, and made me understand his films more, and see how his mind actually was what was affecting how he makes his films, which was very inspiring. And the way he was such a political activist, and he wanted to give this vision of what Africa is, that's something, it kind of even shows the importance of film as a whole. It shows why it's an important industry to have, because you need people to know these things, and it's an easy medium, because like, he was writing books before and he was unable to reach people that way. It shows the reach that cinema has, how good it would be for Uganda for Africa and Uganda as a whole to have a great cinematic world also. It would be really nice. It was interesting to see.
Just like one. We're talking about. Again, Timothy said. It was like he said it was slightly lessened, like his legacy.
No, it's still. I think his personality, like the aura, it's like diminished. But his legacy still stands. But the aura of the man, I think, kind of knows he wasn't.
So I felt that way when I first sort of watched this kid talking about how this guy he looked up to had stolen money from him. Then what follows that up is like this quote where Sembene is like, as long as I'm alive, I'm going to be the best in Africa. So it's like, don't try to beat Sembene at his own game, do something better. So and for me that the admiration for him skyrocketed after that line, because he had that fiery determination. He's like, I will screw you over to get my film made. And for me, it was kind of that, like, that's what it takes to get a film made in this. So it's like, you either beat me or you don't.
Yeah, I understand.
And even in that quote, he said he wanted to stand as an example to younger filmmakers. So for me, it was more of a harsh lesson. I know, he was acting selfishly, but it had that weird, he said he was a man of contradictions. It had that weird subtext to it where it was like this sort of harsh lesson.
He's one of those filmmakers, he's one of those rare filmmakers who, as he gets older, he doesn't lose his edge, which is inspiring as well. And it seems a shame that, something we've all been discussing constantly since we started this was there's no one quite like him. He pushed others to do better and not be exactly like him. And yet you're not getting this culture emerging where there's plenty of different filmmakers competing to better each other. There always seems to be just that one African filmmaker at that one time everyone talks about, and then it moves on to the next and then the next, as opposed to everyone at the same time.
No, but again, I feel with him having the title of the father of African cinema, again, I feel, as you said, again, he was a man of contradictions. Again, I feel a lot of the stuff probably he was preaching against, dictatorial regimes and all that stuff, and having this one guy at the top, which is the same thing in most African countries. I felt he basically did that in that scenario. So that was my only, I think, beef with that. I felt he was.
The truth of the matter is, in the same documentary, he did deny that title of the father of Africa.
Yeah, he did. He didn't like it.
When they questioned him, he was very adamant, very opposed to it because he believed he didn't invent anything, which is true.
Yeah.
He didn't put out anything new. He's just a man who was working.
He did, because he put out like the first sub-Saharan African film. So obviously, because most of the times these names you don't give it to yourself, like Pop give it to you. Yeah, and I feel like him knowing like he's in this position whereby he's respected as the first African person to be on the jury of Cannes and all that. I feel probably, obviously I understand maybe Camp Tiaroy, maybe he had to do what he had to do. He hadn't made a movie in, I don't know, was it 10 years or something?
10 years.
Yeah, so I understand that, but I feel like in general, there should be a lot more proteges who are just as well known as him, because when you see a person like even Mambeti, you hear a person like Bekolo talk about him as being this influential person who really guided him, but I didn't. I saw that with was it Boris Diop or something? He said, yeah, this person encouraged me to read. We all read his books, but in the follow through, like I didn't really see anyone else say, you know, he propped us up to this particular
We're
level.
demanding too much from a normal human being who will be flawed whichever way. He's not going to be this man we thought was guiding the Africans.
I feel there was a lot of pressure on Sembène because I think one thing that can't be underestimated is that arguably with Borom Soret and Lenoir de Black Girl, without him, African cinema wouldn't have been as strong as it was as early on. So he's not just got to make a film. Arguably, he's making the first truly sub-Saharan African film without interference from colonialists. And I think we've got to remember the historical context. He's not a man who is obsessed with his own legacy or the pressure is on him to be that one African filmmaker. But he had to be as ruthless as he was to get a truly African film made and to represent his people, as opposed to the image that the French, that the British, that all the others had put out there in the world. One thing I said to Sharon a while ago is there was the Bantu cinema educational experiment, where the British in South Africa, along with missionaries, were producing a series of informational films and screening them to Africans, but putting forward a certain viewpoint of Africans are inferior, we Europeans need to educate them. So Sembène was up against a lot to break through that barrier, and just the fact the film exists, whether you like it or not, is a milestone, because when Black Girl came out, it showed that there was no going back.
The thing I want to talk about, though, is his... Okay, they said Le Camp Tiaroy was his most controversial movie. I disagree. In the current environment, I think Chedo, what is it called, Chedo?
Chedo.
Yeah, Chedo would probably be his most controversial film currently, because it was criticizing Islam, which is the predominant religion in Africa.
Yes.
And in the current...
It is biggest population now.
Yes, the biggest population is Islam. And in the current environment, politically, even in the world, to criticize Islam from an African perspective is an extreme... I can't even underestimate how bad this would come off to anyone. So even in the current environment, if a person like this was to release this scale of a movie, it wouldn't be received well, even abroad, even in France, where it took them 10 years to receive Camp Tiaroy, or in his own hometown of Senegal, nowhere. So a guy like this, to me, comes off. It seems like he has a penchant for pissing off people. He was on a mission to piss off as many people as he could. And whether he had a point or not, that's up to the viewer. But it's what's being said. He was anti-censorship, which is being very much imposed on people today. Censorship is a thing now. You have to be in a certain lane, you have to be in a certain way, you have to follow the path. It's not just out there, even in African film. It's still very much imposed. Recently in Uganda, wasn't there a person who put on a homosexual play and was exiled recently? Was like a year or two ago. So a guy like this, his relevant isn't the word, he's constant. He's very important to remember that you're going to only celebrate them when they're gone.
I have a question for all five of you, and I'm curious about this. As you know, regular cinema-going Africans, who do you think is a filmmaker who is closest to Sembène in terms of prominence, in terms of being controversial, in terms of always sort of pushing the boundaries? Do you think there's anyone close to what Sembène was currently working in African cinema?
I think the person who I've already cited, again, I would say, okay, maybe scholars have probably read a lot of his material, but I would say again Bekolo, just because he's controversial in the way that, again, I was going to bring this up, that as you can see, Sembène's earlier films, they were very much like the neo-realism films of Italy. I think maybe, as I said yesterday, because of the way they were being shot, it was he's getting stock film from his friends and all that. Yeah, but then I think the person I've seen now is Bekolo, because Sembène, as you said, you can still see his shadow over a lot of African stuff. Like, it's still the same style. Everyone has that. Most filmmakers have that neo-realist style with their films. But a person like Bekolo is more interested in genre, you know. So I feel that's something that's different, because most of the African films we saw growing up, especially in Hollywood stuff, would be like these morality stories and all that. But then seeing someone now like Bekolo who makes a film about vampires, but like in an African context, is still very interesting. So I feel that's the person. Yeah, I know he's from an older generation, because his first film was like 93. Yeah, and that's a bit depressing. As I was saying, there's only in Africa, there's the old filmmaker and the young filmmaker. There's no in between. Yeah. So.
I would go with the guy of Timbuktu and Bamako.
Sissako. Actually,
Sissako,
is really
about
good.
something. I
Yeah,
can't say his name.
Abderrahmane. Yeah.
Yes, I would. That guy he's doing really good. Yeah. Timbuktu is amazing. Bamako is very similar to what Sembène was doing, and I feel like he was inspired by him. I don't know if he has ever said it or not, but he is the guy right now.
I concur with that 100%, because I saw Timbuktu, and that was an amazing movie, and was also doing what Cheddar did, being critical of something that no one else is being critical about. Religion in general, Islam in specific, but because it's the dominant religion in Africa, it's the equivalent of being critical of Christianity in America. That's the perspective people have to keep in mind. So I agree 100% with what you said, Sharon. Yeah.
Someone else I was going to bring up, and I talked to Sharon about this, was the filmmaker from Côte d'Ivoire called Roger Nwan-Mabala, who did a film called Adangaman, and another film called Au Nom de Christ, which is very heavily critical of religion as well. And Adangaman addresses slavery, but from the African perspective of King Adangaman, who did slave raids and sold off fellow Africans to the Europeans. And it's a real shame that Mabala has not really made a lot of films since Adangaman, which was about 17 years ago now. And I feel he's another African filmmaker who has the eloquence and the anger of Sembène, but is hardly talked about because he doesn't have a lot of films to his name.
Yeah, I think that's the case with a lot of African filmmakers, because let's even look at the most influential ones, like Sembène. He had the gap of 10 years between, I think, Chedo and Camp Tiaroy. Then you look at the Mambetis, all those people had, I don't think, more than 10 films. Like, they even had short films. Like, later on in their careers, they had to make short films to kind of tell their stories. So there's really that problem of, like, when you're young, you may be hot here, you make like your 2 films, you win your few awards. After that, the support doesn't come in, or I don't know, maybe circumstances. There's a very big gap in the way films are made here. Even the influential people don't get to make a movie every 2 years, like say Scorsese you get. So there's that. I think that creates that vacuum of, again, analyzing African films. There's no one who is as prolific or consistent as, say, the more mainstream Western filmmakers.
It's interesting you bring up Scorsese, who is everyone here aware of the African Film Heritage Project he just launched?
Yeah.
I think it's great that there's someone as prominent as Scorsese, not just in the West, but over the world, who is a big fan of Sembène, and particularly a fan of Black Girl. And I just think it's a shame that we have to rely on someone of that stature to get African cinema even mentioned or heard of in the mainstream.
Is it because of him that a bunch of people just started watching Black Girl? Because there was a phase where almost everyone was just watching Black Girl. I think it was because he pushed it.
No, but he really does, because I also watched Yelin, but then the copy of Yelin that I watched had Scorsese introducing the film, was it? I think it was Tuki Buki by Mambeti. So the beginning has basically Scorsese trying to, like, I think he was just promoting it. There was this like small clip before the film, so it's good. I think it's someone who really pushes for cinema in general. Yeah, so it's good to have such people again who are in high places, trying to prop up other regions of filmmaking.
To hear that Scorsese talked about Yelin, I've loved that movie ever since I could remember. Suleiman Sisse,
Okay, so now let's talk about Black Girl, which was his first feature film. Yeah, the others were shorts before he did Black Girl, and it came out in 1966, and it's about this girl called Duana. Is that the way they Diana, something like that. The pronunciation is weird, and it's set in post-colonial Senegal, and this lady just is she gets work for a French couple to be their nurse, and they tell her she could go to the two French with them, but in her anticipation she expects it to be really glamorous and enjoyable, this vision that Africans have of the West, but it turns out to be hell. So we're going to talk about that film. I think I would want to start. I really like this film. It's actually my favorite out of what I've seen of his, which is very little though. But this film struck me from the beginning because I especially loved even what the main character looked like. The way they were speaking about how Africans got to see someone that was familiar. This woman is so familiar, and it's one of those toned down. It's not a heavy. It's so toned down. You're just watching her walk through Dakar, and you're really interested to just see her being. It was so fascinating, and how his movies are about what is on ground in African societies is exactly what this film is about. People's admiration for the West and getting there, and it turns out to be complete hell, which is something that fascinatingly still happens today. It was even in the newspapers in Uganda recently. A bunch of girls had gone to the West to be housemaids, and it turned out completely bad, and they were basically slaves, and the embassy had to try and go and pick them up from there. Those are things that are still happening today. So looking at something and it being so realistic, that movie is heavy on realism, which is so fascinating. These are things we only see in the indie movies,
budget filming.
Yes, like he was able to do that, and you're fascinated by the year this was made. It was completely great. I love this movie so much, and how it turns out, the symbolism that's in the film. We have to talk about that first. Joel, I think you should first go.
Awesome. So Black Girl is my second favorite, very close second favorite. I like Borom Saret just a little bit more, but those two films are basically my favorite Sembene era of Sembene, because they're very heavy on subtext. When you go further into like Hala and what's the Camp
Tierra,
when you go into those, he becomes a little more heavy-handed with his message. But with Borom Saret and like Black Girl, they sort of take you off guard, like because you're sort of just watching this regular story, and then you get hit with messages, in small bite sizes, and I appreciate stuff like that. Now, Black Girl was great. You mentioned symbolism. That's, I think, mostly why I loved it.
Yes.
The whole thing with the mask.
Oh, that
was beautiful. I don't know if I interpreted it wrong, but the whole the way I understood Black Girl was like the whole thing was like about like African identity, because she sort of like hands over the mask freely to these white people. it goes along with them, and then things don't turn out to be the way that they were, and then the rest of the movie is about her sort of taking her identity back, and I love that. The ending, I was like, no. I didn't. Well, that's the one thing where I didn't feel it was as necessary.
I loved the ending.
It didn't make sense for me, because at first it was like this uplifting story, like I'm going to take my identity back and I'm going to go back to Dakar. That's what I was visualizing, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, she's gone. I was like, shit, and I was filled with all this anger and all this rage. Maybe that was his intention.
Yeah.
But yeah, but yeah, if the payoff was that final scene with the little boy following the white man around with that sort of, it had the sort of white guilt.
White guilt.
Yeah, connotation attached.
White guilt.
It was very haunting. It was a very haunting scene. I really loved it. Yeah, Black Girl was a phenomenal movie. I think as far as feature films, that's my favorite of his. It was absolutely fantastic. Yeah.
Oscar?
Just before I give my thoughts on the film, I'm probably reaching here, but has everyone here seen the new Black Panther trailer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's this one shot where Michael B. Jordan's character is going to break in somewhere, and he wears the tribal mask. And I wonder if maybe this is Ryan Coogler doing some little tribute to Black Girl. I'm probably reaching.
Probably.
Probably. So I also prefer Borom Saret to Black Girl, although I still enjoy Black Girl. And probably the reason is the camera work in Black Girl feels a lot less kinetic and a lot less dynamic. It's not a very cinematic film. It feels very obvious, as opposed to Borom Saret, that this is coming from a filmmaker who was previously a novelist. So it's a film that's more about message and more about dialogue than telling the story through images and framing shots. But what really shines through is the acting, as well as the voiceover work. And I feel that the simplicity of it does benefit it in some way. It feels quite similar, as well as Italian neo-realism, which was mentioned. It also feels like French new wave to some extent. So it's quite obvious that Sembène is well educated in cinema, which helps him make a better film. There's a lot of flaws to it, such as I think Joanna's suicide is very sudden. It just comes out of nowhere. It doesn't shock you. It just sort of, it lets you down a little bit because there's no build up to it. But then I feel the ending just makes up for any flaws that we've seen earlier on in the film. I find the ending very powerful. It stays with you. It's a statement. Everything about this film, as opposed to Borom Saret, which is just a story told very well, everything about this is a statement. It's an announcement that Sembène has arrived, that African cinema has arrived. And although Black Girl is sort of rough around the edges in many ways, and it feels more theatrical than it does cinematic, it's very obvious from the start that Sembène's a very confident director. Even if the film doesn't quite live up to his ambitions, it's very clear that he's achieved everything he set out to do with this film.
Nick?
Hey, me? Anyway. I'm going to talk about Black Girl, which I watched this morning. So it's very fresh in my mind. I'm going to disagree with a lot of what has been said before me already, particularly concerning the suicide of the protagonist. I remember halfway through watching this movie, I said, the only way this thing ends is in a triple homicide. Okay? It ending in a suicide was like a cutback. I was fine with that. The way I saw this movie is, as the documentary put it, what we were just talking about before, is this movie was trying to show us the perspective of an African girl through the African girl. We see her, there's a lot of shots of just her face alone. And she's beautiful and she's amazing and she's always dressed the way she wants to. she went to France to see the shops, as she kept saying, the shops, the what. She wanted to send pictures back to Dakar to make everyone feel jealous. She wanted to send money back to her mother, who wrote a letter to her allegedly about her being sick. She wanted to be in France, but France to her was the kitchen, the living room, the washing room. That's that. For months on end. It made sense to me that eventually her leaving France would be more of a metaphor than reality, and also reality in a sense, because she, killed herself. So she left. When she does leave, all she leaves her tormentors, the torment of having had her around this long, which is the ultimate revenge, I think. I liked Black Girl because I liked it a lot because it was more focused on her than anything else. It was more focused on her than her boyfriend when she was in the car. It was more focused on her than that kid or her mother when she was there. She was more focused on her when she was employed in France, even when her mistress was showing her the river and Cannes and whatever. It was always about her. So the camera was, if she's going to experience the kitchen, the living room, the washing room, you're going to experience the kitchen, the living room, the washing room. If all she's seeing is the mask, that's the only decoration I saw on the wall. I couldn't see anything else, to be honest. I'm pretty sure there are pictures, but that's the only thing I remember, because that's probably the only thing she remembered. It was very well done. I've only watched 2 of his movies, this and Camp de Terrorist. Yeah. I think this is one of his better ones.
Okay. I just want, yes, I said everything almost, but then I was just going to say that the end for me, okay, not the end, Diwana's death, I wasn't too bad at that because I felt it could go very many ways, as you said, a triple homicide, suicide, all that. But then, again, adding to what Sharon said before, I felt her suicide, again, basically represents the kind of suicide when people usually go out looking for work, from Africa. For a lot of people travel there. You make money that when you change it to like Uganda shillings, it's a lot of money, yeah. So, but in the end, it's basically like suicide because you're in this constant state of slavery. So, I felt the suicide in that basically represented this kind of her going there with this dream, and in actuality, she was just basically giving up herself to a life she hadn't really thought she was going to live. So.
I like what you said about like we're in constant slavery. It just was weird that they had just come from being colonized, and then you're still being fascinated by the white man who has just come from oppressing you. That stuff just is really painful to see, and of course this is something the post-colonial world is still going through right now, which really sucks.
I don't know though. It doesn't suck. It doesn't seem. All I'm saying is it doesn't seem irrational to me to still be fascinated by a motor vehicle when all your life you've been propagating by your feet. Okay? That's not irrational, that's natural to me. So yeah, of course if they tell you there's this place where nothing is this is the way you see it, this landscape of hills and valleys and lakes, that's not there anymore. It's towers, it's stuff you can't even imagine. I would want to go there too.
It doesn't translate to you having a better life there.
No, it doesn't. But I would still want to go there. For example,
stay there?
No, she went there. She didn't want to stay there. She killed herself.
Exactly, but she wanted to stay there when she went there.
When she just touched down, you mean?
As in, that was her.
After she entered there, her reality became the kitchen, the living room, the washing room. That was her reality.
Yeah.
Her dream was the place, and that dream exists. I mean, you've seen more of the worlds with the aliens showing up and all that. Had they been doing something more creative along the lines of we'll take you to our alien world where things are unusual, you'll be in Guardians of the Galaxy basically. I bet they'd have gotten a lot of people along too. It's just that you go there, your reality becomes you're subservient to the master race or the people who are better than you. and your only choice is either to try your best to go back home, which you can't, or to kill yourself in a bathtub, which she did.
Which still makes it sad.
It's sad, yes, but it's not irrational. That's what I'm saying.
I don't think the movie really shies away from that particular point. Because I like the whole visual. She had this beautiful view outside her window.
She was in which town was it? Which French? Some famous
She
French
was
town.
on the Riviera.
It was on TV.
Yeah, but yeah, she was okay. It's like an outside looking in, but she was like on the inside looking out.
Yeah.
But she could never go there.
Yeah, she was actually there, but she couldn't.
Yeah, so it was like very symbolic of this constant barrier that was still there. Like as much as we want to be part of, there's still this big old barrier.
I think what's very important to remember is even throughout all this, Joanna isn't just a victim. She's very, very defiant, even into her last act of committing a suicide. She's subjected to this, but she doesn't just put up with it lightly. And it's a very witty film. I always found myself laughing at her and how she just completely ignores Madame and doesn't, won't be taken for granted. So even though she's stuck inside the apartment and that's her image of France, is the kitchen, the living room, her bedroom, she doesn't take it lying down. I feel that's very telling that this is Sembène's film. And the whole thing feels a little bit semi-autobiographical because it's about an African who goes to France and realizes things aren't exactly as they had hoped it would be. So you could argue Joanna is Sembène in some way.
Oscar.
Yes.
What's your favorite Sembene film?
I would probably say, from what I've seen, Borum Saret. I haven't seen any of his, unfortunately, and a lot of the reason for that is it's almost impossible to find African on DVD, whether you have to get it in from the US, which I've had to do with, for example, Dangaman. I had to get it shipped over from the United States. I would have been watching more of his stuff a lot earlier if it was readily available. For example, I went to a DVD store only yesterday, and they have a huge world cinema section. I'm looking at the Middle East, I'm looking at South America, I'm looking at Spain, I'm looking at China, Korea, and not a single African film apart from Timbuktu, which some people would argue, because it's from North Africa, they threw it in the Middle East section.
Co-produced, yes.
That's what I was saying. It's the great tragedy of African film is that it's not known anywhere, including in Africa, which you'd think would be doing great with it via distribution, but nah.
Well, I think it's great that Samba launched this Kickstarter campaign, and he has arranged for the last few days for Sembène to be screened all over the continent. And I think he's now trying to get some screenings going in the diaspora as well. And it's very important. I'm pretty sure it's still on Vimeo to stream for free. It's on Netflix in the US, and I've been trying to refer as many friends of mine who are into cinema to go and watch it on Netflix as well. The documentary Sembène, not Black Girl, unfortunately. And again, we're making some inroads, Scorsese and the African Film Heritage Project. I just wanted to give it a quick shout out to a company who distributed Sembène and also distribute and hold academic screenings of some of Sembène's films here in the UK, called Aya Distribution. So it's a very small company, but they're doing great work trying to get British people to see African cinema.
Does anyone know where Ugandans can find this? We can't get these things anywhere, Oscar, by the way. There's nowhere. Absolutely nowhere.
They're completely inaccessible. The technology overtook Africa in more senses than one. You get, so even our own stories bypassed us. We can't, it used to be a fire,
Fireplace.
fireplace, and it's an oral tradition. Now it's cinematic, and Jesus Christ, God help me if I know how to deal with terrorism.
I think it says a lot that it's just as difficult to find a lot of African cinema in the UK or in the US as it is in Uganda, regardless of legal downloads or the internet or getting it on DVD. There's still a lot of work to be done with getting these films out there, regardless of where it is in the world.
Yeah. Also, I feel to be bad for you to go before we ask you, because you're a fan of Who Killed Captain Alex. I
Big
just
fan.
want to know your views.
You're the one who's a
Yeah.
fan. I knew you wanted this.
Yeah. So what are your views on the film? How do you view it? Because I'm sure our experiences viewing the movie are very different.
So this is going to it's going to seem a bit silly to say, but I do feel Who Killed Captain Alex is probably the most important African film since Black Girl. That's my view.
I tell her that every day, man.
Because this is the African film that most people know outside of Africa and inside Africa, for better or for worse. I mean, personally, I think it's a great, fun film. I find Niwamany's story and his work ethic inspirational. There's filmmakers all over the world who could learn a lot from what he's doing with Hollywood for no money whatsoever. Yeah. A lot of people call him the African Tarantino here in the UK. But again, this is the first African film that's truly benefited from the internet. Because if it weren't for the internet, nobody outside of his own village would know about Who Killed Captain Alex. And I'm pretty sure we still don't actually know who killed Captain Alex, but...
No one does.
Just a few stuff about like Isaac Niwamanya. Because I've had the opportunity to have one conversation with him, and he has the most fiery determination I've ever seen in a human being. Because he told us he made a feature film for 7,000 shillings, which is like $3?
$2.
$2, yeah. He made a feature film for $2.
The guy made a movie for $7.
So the way he talks is like he doesn't care. No money, all the money in the world. I'm going to make films. It does not matter to me. So he was up there on a panel with filmmakers who were like, "Oh, we don't have enough money to do this,
and they have they're getting grants in
and he was
thousands
like,
of dollars."
And he was like, "I don't care. I'm going to make movies anyway, whatever the scenario." And he had like some words about what was that Idi Amin film, the recent
State Research Bureau.
No, the
Last King of Scotland.
Yeah, Last King of Scotland.
What did he say?
He was saying how it was a crap movie. He was like, I wish I'd given me that money. They've written a much better script, much better film. But he like
for a critic, I want an Oscar for that.
Yeah, but he had like if you saw it in his eyes, he had that actual. He meant it. He had that confidence, like. I know how to tell an African story.
Through that shit.
Yeah.
I remember an interview of him on BBC.
Yeah.
He was saying he does movies like this, that whole superficial violence thing.
Yes.
Because he has seen real violence and he doesn't want to ever commit that to film because Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That's messed up. I kind of respect that.
Yeah, he's a fantastic film.
I would love to give Niwamanya $1 million budget just to see what he does, because it would probably end up being better than a lot of the Hollywood action films right now.
He'd make a
million movies for $1 each.
Okay. Anyway, all hail Isaac Niwamanya.
Yeah, absolutely.
With you being a film scholar, and again you said you work in film distribution, like what do you think people in Nigeria got right that people in probably other countries in Africa haven't nailed yet?
Well, this is a very important point, and I was talking to a filmmaker over in America about this as well when I was discussing the paper in African cinema in general. I think to a large extent the Nigerian film industry has understood the business part of show business. And this is something I feel a lot of African filmmakers could learn from their American counterparts. They can't just make the art, unfortunately. They need to make art that has a universal appeal, regardless of the language. So, for example, China is making a lot of inroads in Africa in terms of finance, in terms of industry, in terms of manufacturing. And China is about to become, if it isn't already, the world's biggest film market. And I would hope that the cooperation between Africa and China would eventually extend to an increase in video on demand, an increase in investment in African cinemas, so it becomes something that Africans are more willing to invest their money into, in terms of something to go and see with the family, with friends, on their own. So I feel if African filmmakers from around the continent look to Nigeria in terms of their business model and how to make money, then that's the moment when African cinema becomes more prominent over the world. I don't feel we've yet had, with the exception of Who Killed Captain Alex, that one big hit. In the same way, for example, in China, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon became the highest grossing foreign language film at the American box office. And it made, I think, something like 250 million. It was nominated for all kinds of Oscars. A couple of years ago, you had a French film called Amour, which was nominated for Best Film at the Oscars, not just Best Foreign Language Film. So I feel Africa is yet to have that global crossover film. I don't know who will create it. I don't know when it's going to come about, but I would hope it would be soon.
Yeah, but I would say, like a filmmaker like say Neil Blomkamp, who made the film like District 9. He's South African, and though Peter Jackson I think was one of the producers of the film. Yeah, they are mainly produced from like other countries pitching, but would you say District 9 is like an African movie with crossover appeal? Because again, it deals with themes like apartheid and all that. Would you say it's an African film, or that's more again Hollywood just set in Africa?
It's a tricky one. For the record, I absolutely love District 9. I think it's one of the best science fiction films ever made. I think Blomkamp's a fantastic director. It does feel like an odd sort of hybrid, and unfortunately that seems like the exception rather than the rule. But I think what District 9's success shows, and you look at the most successful films coming from China, coming out of America, I think the best way forward is whatever that big crossover African film is going to be, it has to be genre. So whether that's a sci-fi or a horror, you look at the success of Get Out all over the world. That succeeded because it's a genre film. People are more likely to go and see sci-fi or fantasy or horror than they are a drama, however good that is. So you...
The Color Purple.
Well, again, you have films like The Color Purple or Blood Diamond. There's certain films from the West about Africa, but they're not being made by Africans and with Africans. So I think whatever that, again, Who Killed Captain Alex, one of the reasons it's a huge success is people love action movies. So it's a genre film. And that's something Nabwana understands.
Yeah, that's it basically from me. My own part of this is a Timothy show.
I know, this is
Cinema Red Pill.
Watch Sembene's films, whoever is listening. Watch Black Girl.
African films.
All of them in general. The Sisako movies, Adanga Man, everything. Look for them wherever you can and try to watch them. They're all worth checking out. I've been here with Joel. Do you have anything you have to plug? Anything you're doing which you want people to see?
No.
Joel's just Joel. Nick?
Hey man. Hey.
Timothy, whose first film is coming out this year.
Yeah, it's just a short film, and don't buy the hype. Don't buy the hype.
Oh, and Gary, who's an award-winning filmmaker here.
He's actually editing my film, so...
Yep, he had his own film last year which won awards. He's a big deal. And me, the host, Sharon. Now, Oscar, I want you to also say what you do before we close.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Make sure to check out the African Cinema subreddit. There's about 7 of us who run the site on a daily basis. You can visit us at reddit.com/r/African Cinema. And pretty soon I'll be hoping to publish publicly my academic paper on the relationship between African and African American cinema, which we've discussed briefly.
Thanks, Oscar, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, you've been listening to Cinema Red Pill. Thanks for listening.